Welcome to episode 6 of the Classic English Literature Podcast. Today, we're going to begin what I'll call a sporadic miniseries. I'd like to begin discussing the legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, but I've been rather intimidated about tackling this subject. The body of material concerning Arthur is so vast. If you count modern retellings in film, these stories have been circulating for well over a millennium, constantly being revised and repurposed and refined to suit the needs of the times and the people. These tales come from Wales and Brittany first, but then France, England, Germany, and now Hollywood. How to do such a vast corpus justice? Well, I can't. Whole libraries, university programs, and podcasts are devoted to Arthuriana. The scheme I've settled on is to devote like an occasional episode to these stories as appropriate to the historical epic we're covering generally. So today we'll talk about Arthur texts during the Anglo-Norman period, particularly the 12th century, and then later in the year we'll look at the massively influential texts of the 14th and 15th centuries, and in the fullness of time, the Victorian retellings will get their go. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to please like and subscribe to the podcast on your preferred podcatcher. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and please encourage your friends to do the same. And if, at the end of the week, you find yourself with a couple of spare farthings, please consider a donation by clicking the Support the Show button. I want to give a very special thank you to listener Frost for becoming the first supporter of the show. Frost comments, favorite class in high school and a great pod. Took a medieval literature class last semester and loved it. We read most of the medieval texts you talked about on the show. Much love. Much love right back at you, Frost. I do appreciate it. Very, very gratified. Thank you so much. I'd also like to say thank you to those listeners who have left reviews. I'm very happy that you're pleased and that your contribution will help others to find the podcast. Gratias tibi ago. The question of the historical Arthur is surely a vexed one. Over the centuries, his existence has been taken as absolute fact and whimsical fancy. He has been cast as the last Roman general of Britain and as a Scots prince adopted by the Welsh. We have an early mention of the Battle of Mount Badon, Mons Badonicus, the engagement that supposedly stemmed the Saxon tide for a time, from the British preacher and historian Gildas in the 6th century, in which the putatively historical Arthur is presumed to have fought. There are references in Nennius's The History of the Britons of the early 9th century, and brief mentions in the Annals of Wales from perhaps the mid-10th century. I think most now accept the notion that there probably was a British war duke whose guerrilla tactics successfully withstood the Anglo-Saxon incursion in the 5th century for a while, and that by force of arms and personality, he became a convenient site for the accrual of legend. The earliest of these legends that we can account for come from Wales, where, according to the generally accepted narrative, the Celtic Britons retired from the advancing Saxons. The Mabinogion, the first collection of Arthurian romances preserving tales of the Welsh bardic tradition, was compiled in the late 12th or early 13th centuries. So until this period, the historical status of Arthur and his warriors remained ambiguous. Was it legendary history or historical legend? The first major compiler of the Arthur tales in England was Geoffrey of Monmouth, a cleric who, as his name suggests, had a close personal and geographical connection with Wales. His History of the Kings of Britain presents the earliest complete narrative of Arthur's career, in about 1136 to 1138, so just before lunchtime. Written in Latin, It aspires to serious research history. He often cites other authorities and witnesses, and in fact, he claims that his book is a translation of an older text that was in the British tongue. However, we now know that this is a truck full of shoemakers, that is, a load of cobblers. Scholars such as Roger Sherman Loomis and Rudolph Willard have gone so far as to call it, quote, fraudulent history. I think that may be a bit harsh. I'm not entirely sure malicious deception was Jeff's plan, but it does test the credulousness of the most credulous gull when he speaks of Irish giants and fornicating demons. Yes, surely, our definition of history as strict and dispassionate reportage is a modern one, and the distinction between history and legend may have been more porous in the pre-modern world. But the history attracted scathing reviews from scholars even at the time. In his preface to History of English Affairs, William of Newburgh, writing in the latter part of the 12th century, tears into Geoffrey of Monmouth with a brutal excoriation. Really, have a listen. Quote, "A writer in our times has started up and invented the most ridiculous fictions concerning them, and with an unblushing effrontery extols the Britons far above the Macedonians and Romans. He is called Geoffrey, surnamed Arthur, from having given, in a Latin version, the fabulous exploits of Arthur drawn from the traditional fictions of the Britons, with additions of his own, and endeavored to dignify them with the name of authentic history. No one but a person ignorant of ancient history, when he meets with that book which he calls the History of the Britons, can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently he falsifies in every respect. For he only who has not learnt the truth of history indiscreetly believes the absurdity of fable." Ooh, slash, and as it were, burn. You may have noticed William's jibe of, quote, Geoffrey, surnamed Arthur. It is indeed true that Monmouth signed his name Geoffrey Arthur. Feels to me a bit like Bela Lugosi coming to believe that he was actually Dracula. Newburgh is harsh, but fair, so score 1 for Billy the Burner. However, hardly anyone reads the History of English Affairs, and Geoffrey's fabulous history still gets the odd eyeball. And the even ones come to that. Game, set, and match for Monmouth the somewhat mendacious. Like the old Liberty Valance quote, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Because Geoffrey's embroidered history, in addition to its literary significance, serves a very practical socio-political purpose for the Norman regime. As a cleric, Monmouth knew his Latin, and would have been quite familiar with Roman and ancient Christian literature. As a Welshman, he probably drank in the old folk tales and legends of Cambria like mother's milk. This allows him, when he sets out on his history, to create a counter-narrative to the Venerable Bede's history of the founding of Saxon England. Monmouth reaches back further, much further, to the Trojan War, and Aeneas's grandson Brutus, who colonizes and gives his name to Britain. If, to the peoples of what is now Wales and Cornwall, the Normans were just the latest in a series of foreign invaders stretching back to Caesar's legions, these most recent arrivals share a mythic, cultural origin story. Romans and their French-speaking descendants and native Brythonic peoples must be related. Thus, it is the Anglo-Saxon culture that is foreign. But we should hardly see this as a nostalgic plea to restore the old Roman hegemony. Far from it. In fact, the Roman Empire serves as the great enemy in Monmouth's version of Arthur's life. Look, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do quick and dirty on Monmouth's version of Arthur. I believe we mentioned in an earlier episode the British king Vortigern, whose rash and hasty decisions brought on the Anglo-Saxon incursion, according to the Venerable. Monmouth casts Vortigern in a similarly Weasley role, this time as one who usurps the British throne after the withdrawal of Rome in an alliance with the Saxon brothers Hengist and Horsa. Eventually, the Saxons get aggressive, Vortigern tucks tail and scarpers, and all are eventually defeated by the British brothers Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon. Now, there's a name from the legendarium that you may recognize. To commemorate the British who died driving off the Saxons, Aurelius decides to build a monument. Now, being no mason or architect, he can't settle on what kind. "Ask Merlin," everybody says. "I know," replies Aurelius with kingly self-awareness. "I shall ask Merlin." And so he does. In Geoffrey's retelling, Merlin is not yet the proto-Gandalf we've come to know. Here he seems to me a more general-purpose wise man. Bit of a shaman, bit of an engineer, bit of a jerk. He says that Aurelius should go to Ireland and steal the great Giant's Ring of Mount Calarius, a monumental ring of massive standing stones. Sound familiar? So, Uther Pendragon takes an army of 15,000 men, invades Ireland, nicks Stonehenge, and that, children, is the God's honest truth. Merlin is loaded with other great news and ideas. After whipping Vortigern a second time, a magical star appears above Aurelius and Uther. Merlin prophesies that Uther will become king, establish a great dynasty, but that the decline of the Britons will follow. Here's where we get the familiar story of Uther fathering Arthur on the Duke of Cornwall's wife Igerna. Merlin gives Uther drugs that change his appearance to that of the Duke's, so Igerna doesn't even know she's being raped. Lovely. The drugs thing, though, as opposed to some magic spell, is an interesting difference. Anyway, this is how Britain's greatest king is conceived. Vile lust in a drug-fueled rape. Auspicious. But it does serve to present Arthur as legitimately conceived, I guess. Now, lest we think Monmouth implicitly approves of these developments, it should be made clear that yet another Saxon attack occurs, and we are given to understand that it is a punishment for Uther's adultery. As a theory of justice, you may do with that as you will. Once Arthur comes of age, and following the death of his father, he becomes king through the normal ceremonial course. There's a marked lack of magic here. Archbishop Dubricius, quote, lamented the sad state of his country. He called the other bishops to him and bestowed the crown of the kingdom upon Arthur. We got no swords and stones, no women lying in ponds, just succession in a time of crisis. And what follows are decades of crisis. Quote, in Arthur, courage was closely linked with generosity, and he made up his mind to harry the Saxons, so that with their wealth he might reward the retainers who served his household. Rather a selective conception of generosity, I must say, but it does bear a striking resemblance to that very Anglo-Saxon bond of comitatus. And that bond would have to hold, for Arthur and his men engage in wars with the Saxons and the Scots and the Picts. During these prolonged struggles, Arthur restores Christianity to York, the northern Saxon capital, as well as restoring the native British nobility there. As a historical analogy, this may seem rather ironic, given the Normans' dispossession of the Saxon nobility. But of course, Geoffrey is seeking to delegitimize the Saxons in favor of a preceding Brythonic claim, so as far as he's concerned, the Normans are restoring what Arthur restored. Then Arthur turns his attention to Iceland and brings that country to heel. His expansion intimidates other chieftains, like the kings of Gotland and the Orkneys, who voluntarily submit to Arthur's overlordship. Now we get 12 years of peace. Monmouth writes, quote, Arthur then began to increase his personal entourage by inviting very distinguished men from far distant kingdoms to join it. In this way, he developed such a code of courtliness in his household that he inspired peoples living far away to imitate him. The result was that even the man of noblest birth, once he was roused to rivalry, thought nothing at all of himself unless he wore his arms and dressed in the same way as Arthur's knights. Seems to me that Arthur gets a big head right now, and gets rather restless. He enjoys the fact that foreign kings tremble in despair when they look upon his mighty works. So he does what anyone would do. He invades Norway, and then Gaul, and Aquitania, and Gascony. Geoffrey of Monmouth details Arthur's ruthless expansion as a historical precedent, and therefore justification, I think, for the similar expansionist designs of the Normans. By the conquest of Norway and what is now France, Monmouth unites the British and Norman lines. Interesting also that Arthur grants the province of Neustria, what would become Normandy, to his right-hand man Bedivere, and Anjou, the origin of the coming line of Norman kings, the Angevins, to his seneschal Kay. Finally, after 17 years of conquest and righteous rapine, the apparently slumbering giant of Rome awakens. 12 Roman envoys arrive at Arthur's court, bearing the olive branches of peace, only to deliver a scathing rebuke from the Emperor Lucius Iberius. He says, "I am amazed at the insolent way in which you continue your tyrannical behavior. I am even more amazed at the damage which you have done to Rome. When I think about it, I am outraged that you should have so far forgotten yourself as not to realize this, and not to appreciate immediately what it means that by your criminal behavior you should have insulted the Senate, to which the entire world owes submission, as you very well know. You have had the presumption to disobey this mighty empire by holding back the tribute of Britain."
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Holly Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Holly Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
Sounds very much like a teacher scolding an ungrateful child. One can hear the tisking and sense the wagging finger. I'm not angry, but I am so disappointed. The catch here, however, is that the ungrateful child is an obscenely successful war chief who will not likely take a dressing down, especially from a soft southerner. Arthur consults his advisors, shrugs off the Roman threat as minor, and disputes Roman claims by his own interpretation of the emperor's fake news. He says, "For myself, I do not consider that we ought to fear his coming very much, given the trumped-up case he uses to demand the tribute he wants to exact from Britain. He says that he ought to be given it because it used to be paid to Julius Caesar and those who succeeded him. When these men landed with their armed band and conquered our fatherland by force and violence at a time when it was weakened by civil dissensions, they had been encouraged to come here by the disunity of our ancestors. Seeing that they seized the country in this way, it was wrong of them to exact tribute from it. Nothing that is acquired by force and violence can ever be held legally by anyone." That last line displays a staggering lack of self-awareness. Does he not control nearly all of northern Europe by right of conquest? Did anyone in council raise the hairy eyeball to that howler? Probably not. Rather, Arthur demands tribute from Rome and wages a successful war to get it. Yes, that's right. Geoffrey of Monmouth has Arthur conquer Rome itself. He's the master of all Europe and significant parts of Asia and Africa. But in these wars, he loses Bedivere and Kay, his minions in France, and he will lose much more, because here's where we get to the juicy, scandalous bits. While Arthur is out teaching Rome a lesson in history and good manners, Mordred, Arthur's nephew, seizes the British throne and the British queen, Guinevere, who hails from a noble Roman family. It's wonderful how Monmouth gets all his political players to behave themselves properly in this analogous retelling, isn't it? But in a moment of frustrating modesty and discretion, our storyteller goes silent. Goes silent in the third person. About this particular matter, Geoffrey of Monmouth prefers to say nothing. Ugh! You can't hint at the most sordid tittle-tattle and then go mum. Spill the tea, as the kids say. I think they still say that. But he doesn't. The tea remains safely in the pot. Instead, as all moral people do, he skips uncomfortably over the sex to return to the placid familiarity and moral wholesomeness of savage violence. Mordred assembles a force of Saxons, Scots, Irish, and Picts to defend against Arthur's reclamation. In a very neat parallel, Mordred reassembles all of Arthur's old enemies to the destruction of the kingdom. The actual deaths of Arthur and Mordred are quite underwhelming. Just a simple statement of fact. Quote, Arthur himself, our renowned king, was mortally wounded and was carried off to the Isle of Avalon. This in the year 542 after our Lord's incarnation. Rather a letdown, isn't it? I mean, we're used to swelly music and dramatic lighting, profound wisdom whispered as the breath expires, tears and sighs. Not for Jeff. Just the facts, ma'am. Except for all the made-up stuff. I think Monmouth's retelling, as perhaps the first major written narrative of Arthur, presents us with a much different hero than we've come to expect in the high chivalric versions of Sir Thomas Malory and Alfred Lord Tennyson, or in the films by Richard Thorpe and John Boorman. At this early stage, Arthur doesn't feel that different from a Beowulf. Very much still the glory-seeking, easily affronted warrior. The sheen of Christianity is, admittedly, much thicker, but the gentleness and courtesy to which Monmouth refers is again and again undercut by Arthur's wrath, his vengeance, his pride. Arthur's pep talks to his armies are harrowing calls to slaughter. Quote, although the Saxons, whose very name is an insult to heaven and detested by all men, have not kept faith with me, I myself will keep faith with my God. This very day I will do my utmost to take vengeance on them for the blood of my fellow countrymen. Arm yourselves, men, and attack these traitors with all your strength. With Christ's help we shall conquer them without any possible doubt. When he urges his men on against the Romans, quote, are you letting these effeminate creatures slip away unhurt? Not one must escape alive. Not one must escape alive. No one must escape, I say. As he shouted these insults, and many others too, Arthur dashed straight at the enemy. He flung them to the ground and cut them to pieces. Their armor offered them no protection capable of preventing Caliburn, when wielded in the right hand of this mighty king, from forcing them to vomit forth their souls with their lifeblood. Woo-hoo. There is a marked anxiety about masculinity in these speeches, and violence and vengeance are the best ways to define and protect it, it seems. Perhaps that's why rape and infidelity play such an important role at the beginning and at the ending of this tale. Arthur's violation of Igerna, and her concomitant, as they would have seen it, unfaithfulness to her husband, is mirrored in Mordred's usurpation of queen and crown. Perhaps in Monmouth's view, masculine power and privilege, over land, over lesser men, over women, is the mysterious force holding a society together, and sexual deviation is the greatest threat. Monmouth still seems to assume that nobility, strength of character as well as of body, is, quote, inborn. He uses the word often in reference to the superiority of, quote, noble birth. One is still born noble in this worldview, though one must continually prove it, usually through strength of arms. This certainly seems continuous with Beowulf's world, but not the seafarers, or at least not entirely. In around the year 1200, a Worcestershire priest whom we know as Layamon, though there are significant differences in spelling and pronunciation, took Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain, by way of a French-speaking poet named Wace, and set it to verse, becoming the first to present the Arthurian story in English poetry. Called Brut, it is immensely long, over 16,000 lines, but notable for its curious mingling of French and Anglo-Saxon poetic devices. He often retains the Old English alliteration and caesura, while complementing them with assonance, that is, the repetition of vowel sounds, and internal rhyme, which was something of an innovative move in the 13th century. His version of Arthur's birth, echoing the legendary birth of Alexander the Great, runs thus, quote, "The fairies gave him the might to be the best of knights. They gave him another thing, that he would be a mighty king. They gave him a third, his death would be long deferred." In this passage, Layamon also uses a poetic device called anaphora, the repetition of a phrase in successive clauses. This gives the lines, I think, a feeling of crescendo, a rushing cascade of blessings. And it also kind of reinforces the magical or miraculous quality of Arthur's birth. There's something of the chanted spell feeling here, you know? As Layamon details Arthur's military history, we get very much the same hyper-masculine Norman warrior hero provided by Geoffrey of Monmouth. In the section called the Battle of Bath, which corresponds, I think, to Mons Badonicus, Mount Baden, Arthur sounds a lot like Beowulf. Quote, "Lo, here are before us the heathen hounds who killed our chieftains with their base crafts. And they are on this land the loathest of all things. And now let us attack them and lay them starkly, and avenge wondrously our kin and our kingdom, and wreak great shame with which they have shamed us. They that over the waves have come to Dartmouth, they are all forsworn, and they shall be lorn. They are all doomed with the aid of the Lord." The concerns of shame and vengeance and disloyalty, forswearing, provoke a dehumanizing view of the Saxons, not only as animals, calls them hounds, but as the damned, calls them heathen. Elsewhere, Arthur refers to the Saxons as goats, which is medieval shorthand for the damned, drawn from the gospel distinction between the sheep and the goats, the saved and the condemned. Interesting to me that Layamon makes liberal and effective use of Anglo-Saxon poetic conventions while casting Anglo-Saxons as the enemies of civilization. As a side note, this battle between the native British and invading Saxons also reminds me of one of our first poems, The Ruin, in Episode 2, in which a Saxon traveler looks at the ruins of Bath, perhaps, and marvels at the giants who must have made such a wonder. Well, you're the one who wrecked it, Bubba. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that in Geoffrey of Monmouth's conception, nobility was a matter of birth. But here in Layamon, there are hints of the coming preoccupation with nobility as a matter of one's behavior rather than of one's bloodline. Arthur establishes the famous Round Table to quell the petty prides of his followers, who get into a rather childish food fight over who should get preferential treating at the dinner table. Arthur chides them. Quote, Sit down at once, each man on pain of his life. And whoever will not do that, condemned shall he be. Take me that same man who this fight first began, and put a withy on his neck, and drag him to a moor, and throw him in a low-lying fen where he shall lie. And take all his kin, whom you can find, and smite off their heads with your broadswords. And the women that ye can find nearest him of kin, carve off their noses and ruin their beauty. and thus will I wholly destroy that kin that he came from. And if I evermore shall hear afterwards that in my court, be he high, be he low, for this same assault stir a quarrel later, no ransom shall be given for him, neither gold nor any treasure, tall horse nor armor, that he shall not die, or be drawn asunder with horses, as beseemeth traitors. Blessed bovine biosolids. Perhaps chides was the wrong word. This is a condemnation in a biblical tenor. The fellow who started the food fight, who thought he deserved the seat of honor, is to be dragged out to the moors, dumped in a swamp, and left to die. His male kin are to be beheaded, and his female kin mutilated. Arthur wipes out their line. Then he claims that anyone who starts another fight to settle any hurt feelings here will be denied ransom and left to a traitor's death. And none of this is contingent upon birth status. Quote, be he high, be he low. Noble men do not start cafeteria fights over their seats. Arthur's pronouncement hardly seems straight out of the Turn the Other Cheek, a guide to Christian forgiveness for the Brythonic ruler. Of course, the more practical solution is to make a table with no seats of honor, a round one, in which everyone is seated equally. And that, children, is how the famous Round Table came to be. And everyone lived happily ever after in a world without distinctions of rank or status, judged not by the blueness of their blood, but by the content of their character. I, for one, am certainly happy to be living in such an egalitarian wonderland. Layamon includes, at the end of Arthur's career, an eerie premonition which fleshes out Monmouth's rather pathetic death scene. Arthur has an allegorical dream in which he sees Mordred coming at him with a huge battle axe, and Guinevere, literally pulling apart the roof of his castle with her bare hands. Arthur stumbles to the ground, breaking his right arm, but grasping Caliburn in his left hand, he strikes off Mordred's head and cuts Guinevere to pieces. Geoffrey tells of a dreamed battle between a dragon, signifying Arthur, and a bear, Mordred. But Layamon's dream is more harrowing and hallucinatory. After his vision of war, Arthur says, quote, but myself I did stand upon a wooded land, and there I did wander widely over the moors. There saw I griffins and grisly fowl. There came a golden lioness, moving over the down, of all beasts the most gracious that our Lord hath made. The lioness ran towards me, and by the middle seized me, and forth she betook me and turned towards the sea. And I saw the waves driving in the sea, and the lioness into the flood went bearing me. When we two were in the sea, the waves took me from her. There came a fish gliding, and ferried me to land. Then was I all wet and weary, and sick from sorrow. Arthur's final vision is a sylvan nightmare of isolation, ending in his rescue by a lioness who bears him to a fish who bears him back to land. Kind of a circular motion here from wood to sea to land again. A return, a premonition, as the legend has it, that Arthur will return when his people need him. After his death, quote, the Britons believe yet that he is alive, and dwelleth in Avalon with the fairest of fays. And the Britons still look ever for Arthur to come. There was never man born, of any maiden chosen, who knoweth of the truth more to say of Arthur. But there was once a prophet, Merlin by name, he foretold in words, his sayings are true, that an Arthur must still come to help the Britons. Incidentally, an older manuscript reads that he will come again to help the, quote, Anglen, i.e., the English. Only a revised manuscript reads, quote, Brutus, i.e., Britons, which of course makes more sense. I'm sure the Norman overlords prefer the update. But it's interesting that even at this early date, the English-British identity is showing a bit of slip. So let's leave Arthur here for the nonce. These first forays into Arthurian literature present themselves as history, but certainly fabulous ones, in which lives parallel lives across generations, dream visions foretell the future, and quite messianic expectations of a resurgence temper the sorrow of death, quite unlike the despair at the end of Beowulf. But in other ways, Arthur still seems a quintessential Dark Age war chief. He is just, at least as that culture defines it, but mercilessly so. Morality is the king's fiat. There is little evidence of emotional or psychological complexity in any of the characters here, though I'm fascinated with Guinevere. What's going on in her head? Layamon doesn't say, given the low opinion of women in this masculine world, but in a history so consumed with loyalty and disloyalty, male characters sometimes risk treachery for personal glory. In this world, women can't earn personal glory. So why does Guinevere go with Mordred? Is it just a misogynistic portrayal of female sexual opportunism? Yeah, but I think there's more than that. Would she have had any agency anyway, given that women were basically chattel, especially at the aristocratic level? If not, then certainly we should pity her, not condemn her. I'll never know, but I like to wonder. Next time, we'll look at one of the most famous Arthurian romances of the Anglo-Norman period, Marie de France's L'Envol. Now we get into some magic, some passionate love, some rather complex women. Great story. In the meantime, please take a moment to review the podcast on your favorite app. Also, I would appreciate any little financial support. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time to the Classic English Literature Podcast. Have a good one, everybody.